Animation, Timeline Essentials and Range Slider. Hello again, and welcome to the world of animation. Now, so far we've worked in the static world of Maya. From here on, we'll be working with the dynamic world of Maya, with the 3D animation. So from here on, we'll be working with animating objects, which is simply creating movements in our scene. Now, we begin our movement into animation, and here in this tutorial, we'll learn about the basics of timelines. Now, we have a scene with an object placed here. Now, if I click this play button over here, watch. Here we have our object bouncing from this point to this point, and the animation is looping, and it happens in space and time. Now, if I click the stop button once, we have the animation stopped. Now, don't worry about these play and stop buttons. We'll discuss these in greater detail in the lessons to follow. Just take a look at what's going on. As I finish my click, watch, the animation stops, and the object currently resides at a point in time. But how do you know that point in time? Well, that's what this time slider is for. And the object is currently residing at this point in time, and the frame we are currently in is blacked out. Thus, the black dot over the frame indicates our current frame location. These numbers in the time slider are simply the frames. So this ball animation takes place for 24 frames, and it takes place over a period of 1 second. Thus, we can calculate where our object resides at which point in time. Now, if I click at a point, say 10, we can have a look at the position of our animated object in the 10th frame. Now, if I click and hold the cursor over the time slider and drag, notice that I can view the animation based on the speed that I drag the cursor. At the right end, we have the text field showing the value where our object currently resides. We can also type in a number to go to that frame. Now let me enter the number 30 and hit enter. Oops, the black highlightation over our frames has disappeared. Where is it? Well, now if I click and hold this bar over here and drag it to the right, then here it is. So this is the range slider, where we can view only the specific frames that we desire to work with. Now, if I click and hold these two small boxes individually and translate them, we're able to define the frames to be viewed in the time slider. If I double-click over the range slider, it will show all the frames in the time slider. If I double-click it again, it will bring us to the earlier range we were in. Now, these two fields to the left and right of the range slider show the frames currently that we have in the time slider, which is technically termed as playback start time and playback end time, respectively. In this text field placed adjacent to the playback start time is termed the animation start time, which represents the starting frame of our scene. Similarly, with this animation end time text field, we can specify where our frame should end. Now, if we enter a value of 10 and hit enter into this first text field, notice that we've shifted the starting point of our animation to 10, and we can only work with the frames that are above 10, and of course the 10th frame itself. Now, if I go ahead and select the object in our viewport, watch, we have red lines in our time slider. Now, what are these? Well, these we'll discuss in greater detail in our next tutorial. So for now, we'll tidy up this lesson on the time slider and range slider. Setting keys. Hello, previously in our lesson on animation, we were discussing the time slider and the range slider and the options within them. In this tutorial, we'll discuss the very important part of animation, the keys. Now, straight away, we'll move into this scene where we have an object here. Now, if I hit this play button once, watch what happens. The object animates from this point to this point. However, if you look at the animation of the object, it translates, rotates itself, and scales from point A to point B. Thus, animation is nothing but the transfer of attributes from one point to another, and it occurs in space and in time. Here, this animation takes place over a period of 36 frames, which is another way of saying 1.5 seconds. But where and how are these attributes stored? Well, that's done with none other than the keys in Maya. Now, we'll be able to view the keys for a particular object only if we select the object for which we want to view the keys. Now, with this object in our scene selected, we have these red-colored lines displayed in the timeline. These are called the keys, and here's the information of our object's attribute values are stored. And this process of storing attributes is termed setting keys. That we'll discuss right now. With the object selected, if I go to the channel box window, notice that all the transform attributes field is colored orange. The color indicates that these attributes have a key set over them. Now we'll learn how to set keys over our objects with a new object. Let me delete this object and bring in a new object to our scene. And here is our object. Now what we'll do now is animate the translation of this object in the Z-axis over a period of, say, 40 frames. Now with the object selected, let me enter a value of -5 in the Translate Z direction of the channel box. Now let's be in the first frame of the time slider and right-click over the Translate Z in the channel box. Now here we got lots and lots of options to choose from. So let me drop the cursor over the key selected. Immediately after I select the option, we have our Translate Z option colored out in an orange color. And with that, we have locked this attribute in our first frame, which is the key that has been set for -5 in Translate Z. With that set, whatever I do with the object, work with its attributes, translate it from here on, at the first frame, our object will retain the -5 value in the Translate Z. Now let me go to the 40th frame and enter a value of +5. Now our object is placed at a value of +5 in Translate Z. Now if I hit the play button, we must view the animation of our object from -5 in Translate Z to +5 in Translate Z, right? Well, if I hit the play button, watch what happens. There's no animation taking place, and our object remains at Translate Z for all the frames. Now if I go to the 40th frame in the time slider, notice that we had the value of -5, and more importantly, there's no key set here. So no matter what, our value won't take effect unless we lock the value of that attribute that we changed or worked with, which is nothing more than setting keys. Now in the 40th frame, let me enter the value of 5 again in the Translate Z, and right-click over and choose Key Selected. Now we have the key in the 40th frame. If I hit the play button once, notice that we have our animation created. Now what Maya does is it calculates the values for the in-between frames and gives us the animation for the value that we locked in. Quite amazing, isn't it? Now before finishing our lesson, we'll look at the other options of setting keys. With the object selected, if I hit S from my keyboard, watch that all the attributes get keyed at that frame. Now basically I wouldn't recommend this option for setting keys because by doing so, watch, we've keyed all the attributes in the channel box. Now since keying unwanted attributes that we're not going to work with will increase the size of our file that we're working with, it's not a good idea. Now while we work with complex animations, we can't always go to channel box and key them. This we can do with an option called Auto Key. Now what Auto Key does is it sets a key by itself for whatever transformation that takes place for an attribute at any particular frame, without the need to set the key manually. I'll show you how to do that. At the very end of the range slider, we have this key icon. Click it once to make the Auto Key option on. The red color over the key states the Auto Key option is on. We can click over the same icon to make it off if it's on and it's uncolored. Now with that left on, let's work with the object. Now at frame say 20, if I translate this object, watch, it sets a key by itself in the time slider. Now this is what the Auto Key does, and we can just work with our animation and need not worry about setting keys again and again in the channel box. But for the Auto Key option to take effect, we must set a key over that attribute manually at the first instance before we move forward in our animation. With that, we're at the end of this lesson on setting keys. In our next, we'll look at the playback controls in the way of manipulating our playback speed. Playback controls. In our previous tutorial, we were discussing how to set keys in a timeline. Now here in this tutorial, we'll look into some of the playback options that we have in Maya, and also we'll set preferences to work with our animation. Alright, let's move into our scene, where I have an object. If I select the object, we have these keys based on which our object will animate. If I click the play button, we have our object animating. If I finish my click over the play button, the stop button evokes in place of the play button. And of course, we can stop our animation with that button. Now, along with the play and stop buttons, we also have these buttons which are collectively termed as the playback controls. And with these playback control buttons, we can control the playback of our animation, which is the motion of our animation. Now we'll look into these options briefly one by one. Now we have the reverse button icon, which is going to play the animation in reverse. We have the stop button evoked to stop that. Not only that, we can also stop our animation from our keyboard if I hit the escape button from the keyboard while the animation is in motion. So what's the hotkey to play the animation from our keyboard? Well, that's Alt and V. Now these two keys, which have sort of a red striation to the play icon, are the option to move between keys. This option will work out only if we have the object selected. Now this button moves one step forward to the next key from where we are now in the time slider. This key obviously moves to the immediate backward key that's present in the time slider. Now when you click this key on, it moves to the next frame forward, and its counterpart moves one step backward. With these two keys at both ends of the playback controls, we can move to the playback start frame or the playback end frame of the time slider respectively. Now if I play this animation, it plays with high speed, that we aren't able to find out what's happening in our animation, right? Well, we can control our playback speed with the playback preferences. And also we have other options to work with our playback, which we'll discuss now. If I click this icon, which is at the very end of the range slider, it takes us directly to the time slider preferences in the preferences window, where we have options to work with the time slider and playback options. Now we'll discuss these time slider options in greater detail in coming lessons, but for now we'll just work with these playback preferences. Let me resize this window and place it here so we can work with these options and view what we can get in the viewport. Now let me go to the 4-view panel first, and if I hit the play button once, watch, we're able to view the animation only in the active window. Now over here in the playback preferences window, we have the first option, update view. Now currently it's in the active option, so we can view the animation only in the active window. Now if I select the option all, watch, we're able to view the animation in all windows. But if you watch carefully, the animation is slowed down. Well, this is because it takes a lot from Maya to bring in the animation to all the viewport. Now to the next option, looping. If the option once is checked, the animation plays once from our start key to the end key and then stops thereafter. The second option is looping oscillate, which when checked loops the animation back and forth. Now the last and default option is continuous play. The animation goes from start to end and keeps looping the animation again and again till it is stopped with the stop button. Now a very important option is playback speed. Currently it's set to play every frame, and Maya reads every frame in the time slider and brings the animation, which is pretty fast when there's not that much key in our animation. If I bring down this arrow, here we have all these options to work with the speed for our animation. If I select the option real time, this option plays the animation for 24 frames per second, so we'll be able to view our animation in real time. Now, this option is most preferred while we work with the character animation. Now what about this time slider preference, Well, those we're going to discuss in our next tutorial, and we'll finish our lesson on playback controls right here and now. Changing renderers in Maya. Well, welcome back to Maya with rendering. It's been a long journey in Maya, and we're going to end this journey after we pass this lake of rendering. And then you'll get the license to trespass in any area of Maya. Yeah, that's it. We'll keep moving forward and start our rendering chapter by looking at the rendering settings here in this first lesson. Alright, now we have our scene with this model in our viewport. If we have to take the output of our scene, probably we would hit this button and obviously we'd have this render scene. But what brings in this high-resolution digital image, including its size and so on and so forth? Well, this is what is done behind the scene. And here in Maya, we do that with the help of a window, the Render Settings window. And we can get it by clicking this last of the rendering icons, which we haven't used so far in our tutorials. And on clicking this, we have this window, the Render Settings window, to define the settings that we desire for our output. We can also get it from the menu bar, and here in the window menu in the Rendering Editor's sub-option. If I click this Render Settings, it will bring us this same Render Settings window. Now before looking into these settings, first we look into these rendering icons that we have in the status line. This first icon, Open Render View on click, just opens the render view with the previously rendered scene. Now the second icon on click gives the output after it renders the current scene in our viewport. The third icon, Interactive Photorealistic Renderer, with which we can visualize the output as we work with our object. Now, hopefully you know what that's all about, as we made our way out in the texturing and lighting lessons with IPR Renderer. Now let's get back to the Render Settings window, and we'll sort out the important options in it. The first tab, Common tab, is common to any type of renderer. But I didn't speak about the type of renderers yet, have I? Well, that we'll discuss at the end of this tutorial. For now, we'll just look into these options first, which are very common to any type of renderer that we have in Maya. In the first option, File Name Prefix, we can specify the name of our output scene, or else our scene would be rendered with the default name of the scene. And in that option below that, we can specify the format of our output. In the Frame Animation Extension option, we can specify the file extension of our output scene. For example, if I select name.ash.extension, you watch here. This will be the format along with the output will be produced. The name option in this sequence will be replaced by the name that we specify for the file, followed by the number sequence in the ash position, and then the format in which our scene will be produced. In that list, you can opt for the one that best suits your rendering type. In the Frame Padding option, we can specify the number of digits we require in the frame number extension. If I set a value of 2, watch, our initial frame number would be 0, 1. If I enter a value of 3, the initial frame would start with 0, 0, 1. Here in the Frame Range option, we can specify frame range within which the render should take place. And in the By Frame option, we can set in by how many frames the render should take place. Now, if I type in a value of 2, every second frame within this frame region we've specified here alone will be rendered. With this option, Renderable Cameras option, we can specify the camera in which the render has to take place. Now, the next sub-option in the Render Settings window, Image Size. With all these options, we can pretty much work with the resolution of our output file. Now, I would ask you to find out what we haven't seen yet. Now, these are the properties that are common to the image. You can figure it out on your own. In the Render Options submenu, we can check on or off the default light. While working with lighting, there will be time when we wouldn't want our default lights to hinder any of our accurate lighting effects, and that's when we would just plug it off. Now, by default, Maya renders all our files with the Maya Software Renderer. Now, I'll tell you what the other renderers are very soon, but for now, in this Maya Software tab, the default renderer in Maya, we can set the quality of our file depending on the output that we work. If we need to preview our output, and if it's not the final one, we can set it to Preview Quality option, which won't take up much time to render. After looking at the corrections, we can then go with the production quality for the final output. All the other options are pretty much connected to the resolution of our image, which I would ask you to sort out on your own. Now, if I click this arrow to bring down the options, we have the other two renderers. Maya Hardware Renderer, which is pretty much the same as the Software Renderer, and the next very important Mental Ray Renderer, which we're going to discuss in the tutorials to follow. For now, we'll wrap up this lesson on render settings. In the next tutorial, we'll take another important renderer in Maya, ray tracing.